Okay, just a couple of seconds. Okay, so we are live also on YouTube too. I will restart my brief presentation of Professor S. He's Professor Emeritus at the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Oslo. He holds a PhD from the Pennsylvania State University, and his research focuses on the intersections of philosophy, computational technologies, applied ethics, religious studies, and media studies. He's particularly interested in research ethics, digital religion, virtue ethics, and obviously media and communication. In addition to the teaching and research activity, he is part of the editorial board of several journals, among which the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication and the International Journal of Media and Cultural Politics. And he is member of the editorial board of two important projects, like the book series Understanding Life Online of the Oxford Internet Institute, and the one of the volume on religion of the series Introduction to Digital Humanities of de Gruyter. He counts several publications. I just want to recall his latest book, Digital Media Ethics, and his participation in the On Life Manifesto, with a chapter entitled The On Life Manifesto, Philosophical Backgrounds, Media Usages, and the Futures of Democracy and Equality. Beyond the academic world, he is a special scientific advisor for DIGMEX, the Digital Media and Existential Issues and Challenges project, and he holds several workshops on research ethics, both for graduates, so for scholars and for professionals. And he's founding members of the Computing and Philosophy Conferences, now International Association for Computing and Philosophy. And so, as you can certainly see, he's a very prestigious guest for us. And so we would like to thank Prof. S once more for dedicating us his precious time. And thank you very much. So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks, first of all, for the opportunity to be here. As we chatted a little bit starting in on this, colleges are near and dear to my heart, especially if they involve philosophy. So let me get the inevitable PowerPoint screen and see how we go here. I really am honored by the invitation to join you today. I appreciate the opportunity to revise and review and refresh some of my work that you have looked at. And we'll see if it is relevant and helpful to you in some way. The picture on the right, lower right, is a Sami drumhead. And this is partly because I've become accustomed to recognizing our indigenous ancestors, whether we're in Norway, where the Sami are, or where I am now in Minnesota. There's a nice little phrase of saying, I gratefully acknowledge and pay my respects to the First Nations peoples of this land, in this case, the Dakotas, where we are in Minnesota, and its waterways. I discovered only yesterday, I know something about the history of the genocides, but the area we were in yesterday has the odd distinction of being one of the first concentration camps in 1862, 1863, as part of the American genocide. Much more happily, I want to thank Alicia and Francesca and David and Simone for the invitation and helping me get all this together to begin with, and for a very nice warm-up chat as we were waiting for this to begin. So I want to cover quite a lot of territory, and I will start with some backgrounds and then move to a first series of contrasts regarding privacy, starting with the United States versus Germany, and then East vis-a-vis West. And those little asterisks that you're seeing are ways of marking that these terms are contested, complex, perhaps ultimately useless. Our philosopher of language can comment on this as we go along. So I use them with care, but in any case, if we can use them as at least a kind of starting shorthand, then what we will see is that these initial contrasts rest upon basic conceptions of selfhood, starting with more individual towards more relational conceptions. And these undergird, again, Western with an asterisk, Kantian conceptions of autonomy, which undergird democratic notions of equality and rights, starting with positive privacy rights, in contrast with Eastern or more relational conceptions of selfhood, which, as we will see, start giving us negative conceptions of individual privacy, as well as more hierarchical and authoritarian systems. We'll look specifically at the Chinese social credit system. Again, I'll say several times, I hope that these are vast oversimplifications, but we have to start somewhere. I'll then turn to internet-facilitated communication and social media, because this has pushed or fostered a change towards more relational conceptions of selfhood and perhaps more authoritarian and hierarchical directions in traditional Western democratic societies. Fortunately, there are middle grounds between these two. I will use primarily the notion of relational autonomy, which holds together both a Kantian notion of autonomy plus relationality. This will get us into ethics. I won't say much about what deontology is, except to say here, if you don't know what deontology is, you can use a sort of shorthand version of it as an emphasis on human rights, first of all, even if protecting and sustaining those rights may be expensive, it may cost you something. And we'll see that this contrasts with a utilitarian approach, which is much more willing to trade off costs in terms of human rights, at least of a few, against the so-called greater good of the many, or the greatest good for the greatest number. The third ethics tradition that I will invoke is virtue or capability ethics, and then show some examples of this in praxis in Norwegian law and ethical guidelines. This will lead to the possibility of something called ethical pluralism in intercultural information ethics, as it has been called now for over 30 years, and maybe some possible conception of an intercultural privacy. But to get to this, I'll need to spend more time on what ethical pluralism is. A short version is here. It can join shared or global ethical norms and values with local traditions and practices as interpretations or applications of such norms. I'll give you examples of these. These are not just theoretical. And then towards the end, see if we might find a possible pluralistic intercultural privacy that will actually work to protect individual privacy rights and collective privacy rights against the various well-known encroachments, corporate and government surveillance, preemptive policing, and so on. Part of the background for this work, that is, as was mentioned, the DitchMax network has evolved into a new project called BioMe, Existential Challenges and Ethical Imperatives of Biometric AI in Everyday Life Worlds. This is located at the Uppsala Informatics and Media Hub for Digital Existence in Uppsala, Sweden. The primary leader of it is Amanda Lagerqvist. And so you'll hear a fair amount of reference to AI. As was mentioned, I've done also a fair amount of work in internet research ethics specifically over the last 20 years. And what's important for these purposes is that this work has given me sort of test beds, or what I sometimes call ethical sandboxes, for developing and applying nice theories about, say, pluralism and or dialogical or processual approaches to making good judgments. A word you'll hear me use frequently here is phronesis. It's a Greek term. We get it from Aristotle, but other sources, as we'll see. It's a kind of reflective judgment that will be central in several ways. Last but not least, for nearly 20 years, I did work with this conference series, The Cultural Attitudes Towards Technology and Communication, CATAC. And I want to spend a little bit of time giving you some background from here. We started with the sort of optimism of the 1990s that by wiring the world with the internet, this would lead to greater democracy, freedom of expression, gender equality, the democratic impulse or emancipatory impulse of computer-mediated communication. We could show by the early 2000s that this optimism was not always well placed. I won't rehearse all of the research reports that are collected in this histogram, but what they basically show you is, starting even within the United States, if you make distinctions between white middle-class males who were the primary users and designers of these technologies, at least then, perhaps not surprisingly to us these days, these technologies are responded to, sometimes rejected, sometimes redesigned by different communities within the United States. The further away we went from that US center through Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and finally indigenous peoples, the more resistance and rejection we found to a flat out no in the case of the Kiribati people. These are an island fishing people. They welcome technologies like diesel engines for their fishing boats. But the egalitarian possibilities of the internet was a direct threat to their traditional, more hierarchical understanding of what information could be shared among what members of the tribe or the clan. And so this foregrounded for me what I called the danger of computer-mediated colonization, yet one more time. To be sure, there were some nice examples of emancipation, including among women in the Middle East. So there are articles to be read if you're interested. But at the same time, as we now know, with great bitterness perhaps, by 2011 and 12, we also had the Arab Springs and the Arab Winters. And one of our keynote speakers in 2012 was Rasha Abdullah, who was both an activist and scholar in Egypt, who brought us that bad news. CATAC also is important because it raises the pesky problem of culture. What do you mean by it? There were early frameworks. Some of you may know these by Gerd Hofstede. This included the individual collective axis that I will use. E.T. Hall was also important for his distinction between high content, low context communication preferences, which are largely Western, versus low content, high context, which are characteristic of Arabic and Eastern societies. This is probably still a useful distinction, but culture began to break down, not through just postmodernist deconstruction, but through these kinds of efforts to explore culture and technology. The American Anthropological Association declared in the early 2000s that culture is simply useless. We can't operationalize it in any kind of helpful way. So I will still speak of culture, but I will use it with caution. Jose Nocera has suggested we use the term culture as a kind of can opener. Here he is doing some work with rural Nigerian farmers in Namibia, saying what we now know with greater confidence, that technological artifacts are endowed with cultural and social dimensions which drive their development in history. Users should be seen as people using technology with specific objectives, material, social, and cultural, and motives that are socially and culturally shaped. But broad-term conceptions of culture are simply starting points. At the same time, I've also learned what I hope might be a useful mantra. The only thing more dangerous than making cultural generalizations is the reductionism that results from not doing so. This is to say, if we don't try to take on the diversities of culture, cross-cultural understanding and communication and so forth, yes, we will encounter many multiple difficulties. As we say in Norwegian, I know these on my body, and I'm sure you do too. as well as multiple risks. But the only way to know if this will work is to try. I think either piecemeal, as Binagupta said in 2002, or holistically, as you and Bonin said. I sometimes use a Japanese proverb that what we're trying to do here is to cross the river by feeling with our feet. Unlike the beauty of mathematical problems and problem solving, where we get, on a good day, nice, clear, distinct answers quickly or slowly. When we feel with our feet across a murky river, it's one step at a time. We will make mistakes, but we might make some important kind of progress. So to go to privacy, some first contrasts. Again, at the risk of vast oversimplification, you can understand the United States in terms of an emphasis on consumer sovereignty. I also have dyslexia, which is a real problem for a scholar, so please excuse these occasional slips. The emphasis on consumer sovereignty in the late 19th century, in contrast with, say, Germany. Germany focused on the unfettered creation of the self, on the fashioning of one's image and the realization of one's potentialities. You may recognize this from the traditions of German Romanticism or English Romanticism, which I think had some impact in Italian cultural and intellectual history as well, but I will rely on you to tell me that. This gave rise to a German tradition that treated the protection of individual privacy as one aspect of the protection of the personality more broadly. So privacy is part of free self-realization. In the 20th century, this becomes encoded in the German constitution, the Grundgesetz, as a Persönlichkeitsrecht, a right to personality, which is something that it took me a while to understand. This right to personality, self-development, and so forth is part of what privacy protection is also about. This is affiliated with how we understand property and copyright. So this matter of art and the person and free development is behind the European understanding of the moral rights of the author, droit moral de l'auteur, approximately, such that that is what is protected in European copyright. By contrast, in the US, we start with a notion in the 18th century of liberty as a right to freedom from intrusions. And by the way, I see people starting to scribble and take notes, and please do, but these slides will be available. So don't feel compelled to capture everything by any means. And so in the United States, privacy, the discussion of privacy has emerged primarily in terms of notions of individual privacy and the protection of individual spaces, with the bathroom and the bedroom being the sort of paramount or iconic spaces of privacy protection. In terms of property, the US has emphasized, instead of the rights of the author, property as an exclusive property right, and hence copyright as a way of ensuring that authors or inventors will get money for their work. This is part of the larger emphases in the 19th century on laissez-faire free market capitalism. And so this leads to a characteristically US utilitarian emphasis on maximizing economic freedom, freedom meaning negative freedom, meaning freedom from government regulation, in hopes that this will maximize competition, maximize productivity, maximize efficiency, again in the utilitarian phrase, at least the economic greatest good for the greatest number. And so if you explore US privacy regulations, what you'll find is a patchwork. It's relatively weak. There's no such thing as a federal privacy data protection officer. And this contrasts sharply with the EU deontological emphases. Again, an emphasis on the rights, starting with protections of privacy, over economic or utilitarian emphases. More carefully, what you'll find in these documents in the EU is an emphasis on balancing rights with economic development. So not surprisingly, if we move on to East-West distinctions, or perhaps surprisingly, at least until 1985, what we would find in countries such as China would be a negative conception of individual privacy. I don't read Chinese and I don't pronounce it at all, so this is an approximation, but I can see the characters, and so you'll notice a difference between the first character in this term transliterated as yinqi. In the 1985 version of yinqi, it meant this was the only term available for something like privacy, and it was defined as something hidden or a bad thing, a shameful secret. And this was in keeping with familial privacy in traditional Thailand as a kind of collective privacy. And we can now document a lot of examples from Japan, Africa, and indigenous societies that make the same point. Again, these are broad contrasts, and they're dangerous and risky. And one of the reasons they're dangerous and risky is that these distinctions are now blurring. Starting in 1985, there is a different term, which still sounds like yinqi to Western ears, but it is a different term. And it now has an understanding of privacy as a positive good. And so it is allowable now, at least last report, to say, I don't want to tell you something because it is yinqi. It is a personal thing that I do not wish to tell others or to disclose in public. So what had been a kind of Western conception of individual privacy can now be found in China and other such places. You can see the same sort of thing with the Hong Kong protesters, Western notions of democracy, etc., spread in some way or another. Another reason that we have to be careful of these vast oversimplifications. What do we mean by culture? If we try to operationalize it, we can find anywhere from 7 to 70 different elements that anthropologists and others have identified as culturally variable. But again, these change over time. I do not have it written on the slide, but the simplest and most effective definition of culture is this is how we do things here. You'll find that works wherever you are. This is how we do things here. That's what our culture is. And so I suggest that we think about culture as a blur across many elements across a continuum. I don't know if you're familiar with this map from the Engelhardt-Wetzel World Values Survey. If you start in the middle of the map going down, so you read the axis on the left, going down traditional versus secular values, we move into countries that are more traditional, which means guided by religion and community practice. Above the middle, we move into societies that are more driven by secular values or rational secular values. You may or may not be heartened to see that Italy is square in the middle, almost square in the middle of Catholic Europe. There are reasons for this. So not fully driven by religion, but not as secular, if you will, as either Confucian societies or Protestant societies in particularly my part of the world. If you go from left to right, this is for the Marxists in the group. I count myself as one, at least, a Marxian. This is a matter of economics. If you are in a poor country, your primary values are survival. If you are in a wealthy country, especially oil-rich Norway these days, you have the luxury of self-expression. So these are helpful, especially for comparative purposes, but no one would say, first of all, that all individuals fit within these nations fit exactly in the dots indicated here. So again, we can use these, but we want to be careful. I'll come back to this slide towards the end. Another set of distinctions has to do with moving towards greater social equality, which is certainly true in the Scandinavian societies, less so in Germany and the Netherlands, but certainly more equal than the more hierarchical societies of the United States, the UK, and so forth. There's also this individual relational component. And what I will ask at the end is, where do you think Italy fits, or the various societies and subcultures of Italy? So, as I suggested, all of this depends upon, trying trying to see where I am and make sure I'm not too far behind. Okay. All of this depends upon conceptions of selfhood, starting with the more individual versus the more relational. If you study the history of Western philosophy or Western political science, you will find that, especially in the high modern era, following Hobbes and Descartes, we focus on the self as the primary and perhaps only reality. Descartes' famous, I think, therefore I am, but everything else is questionable. In Locke and Kant, this leads to the political foundations of something called autonomy, autonomos, self-rule, a rational being capable of self-rule. Charles Taylor characterizes this as being a radically reflexive or disengaged rational agent, which has a very great good of radical independence, self-responsibility, and freedom from established custom and locally dominant authority. This again leads to individual freedom and autonomy as justifying or requiring the modern liberal democratic state. My mentor in Confucian thought, Henry Rosemont Jr., characterized this as the peach pit self. So whatever happens to the externalities of the body, underlying it ostensibly is a relatively continuous self-identical entity or personhood. Of course, there are a number of criticisms of what you would call the modern liberal, typically white male subject. I won't go into these. It's not that they're unimportant; they're terribly important, but we can save that for discussion later on. This is not only modern, however. It is rooted, I think, more fundamentally in Western humanistic traditions, starting with what one writer has called the Antiquity Moment. If you're not familiar with Antigone, or you'd like a little bit of refresher, Antigone's brother Polynices was killed on the battlefield in the Civil War. And the new victor, Creon, the new tyrant of Thebes, has decreed that all of those killed who opposed him are to be left on the battlefield unburied. Antigone is Polynices' sister. If she fulfills her citizen's duty to obey the superior authority of Creon, then she violates her familial duty to bury her brother. But if she buries her brother, she will, by obeying her family duty, she will be killed by Creon for violating superior authority. This is a lose-lose choice. But it is also one, if you read the play in Greek, that involves this interesting notion of phronesis, of reflective judgment, that is different from a more determinative kind of judgment, partly because it is embodied. I don't know what you say in Italian, but in English we will say that something is a judgment call. And what we recognize there is that we can make different judgment calls. These sometimes involve tacit intuitions, what my heart tells me, what my gut tells me. This is not naive folk psychology from what we know now in neuroscience. This is partly how human beings do make difficult decisions. What's also important about this Antigone moment is that this is a break between the family and the state that was never experienced in China. And so this marks a very distinctive Western tradition, with the asterisk, of disobedience to authority as essential to growing up, critical to our senses of identity, autonomy, and our capacity to take responsibility for our lives and others. On some readings of the second Genesis creation story, the so-called Adam and Eve story, early Christian and traditional Jewish readings read the story in this way, that disobedience for all of its costs was necessary in order for human beings to grow up. This is also part of the Delphic and Socratic injunction to know oneself, and thereby to escape the cave of political conventions and social conventions. If you remember or you have read about the allegory of the cave, you know that it involves escaping the chains of such conventions. And this requires, among other things, disobedience. Again, in political terms, this is in the heart of the modern liberal democratic state. In my view, especially as it involves traditions of nonviolent civil disobedience in the name of emancipation, greater equality, and social justice. And also what Murray Hildebrand has identified as the central right to resist, disobey, and contest accusations against us in a court of law. So I mentioned to you in our discussion that I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam era. So this is something that I think is terribly important, very much, if not more so, still today. You may not recognize this woman. Her name is Tess Asplund. She stood up single-handedly, literally, against neo-Nazis marching in the Swedish city of Göteborg a few years ago. And she has thereby become an icon of this form of disobedience in the name of emancipation and equality and so forth. You can do that within a Western frame. It is more difficult and perhaps impossible in a traditional Eastern frame. For example, the Confucian tradition, in which the self is understood relationally, I am my relationships. As a spouse, as a friend, father, child, brother, uncle, teacher, much less member of larger communities. And this is also found in African philosophy. A person is defined through his or her relationships with other persons. This is also in Buddhist traditions. So the onion that you're seeing to the right of the screen is a kind of icon for this, as each ring in the onion involves relationships of different sorts. If you take one of those relationships away, take away one of the rings of the onion, the self is diminished. If you take away all the relationships, there is no self left over. And so, again, this gives us those negative conceptions of individual privacy that we saw before, but it also brings with it in political terms, the emphasis on submission of the self to hierarchical and non-democratic societies. This is in the Confucian notion of filial piety, the son's obedience to the father, but also if any of you have studied martial arts, you know that you have to submit to the master. If you need a pop culture version of that, you can watch Kung Fu Panda, which we did last night, a lot of fun. But this then means that something like the Chinese social credit system, in a certain way, makes sense in an Eastern context, and it doesn't make sense in a Western. A very brief account of it is that it will use surveillance and data mining to assess citizens, businesses, and other organizations with regard to their creditworthiness, adherence to law, and compliance with the government's ideological framework. This looks like Big Brother and the Panopticon to us, but for many Chinese, they very much approve of this system as contributing to law-abiding and ethical conduct in the Chinese society and economy. We'll see at the end why that might make sense for still other reasons. Again, all of this is more up in the air because for the last 50 years, if not longer, we in the West have been changing as well, with notions of selfhood moving towards more relational ones. You can see it in ecological ethics, in phenomenology, in Habermas's communicative rationality, which is an interesting quote as it involves the integrity of individual persons and the web of interpersonal relationships. If you are familiar with feminist philosophy, starting with Feminist Ethics, the work of Carol Gilligan, and her account of women as a group tending to make their decisions more on the basis of empathic understandings of what is best for a web of relationships. This also is a matter of more relational senses of self. It is not then accidental that in the last 40 or 50 years, virtue ethics has also become more prominent. A quick definition of virtue ethics is that it focuses on the practices, habits, abilities, virtues that are required for relational selves to foster contentment and community harmony. A more simple version of this, as was identified by Shannon Valor, is if you are practicing the virtues or capabilities of patience, perseverance, and perhaps empathy, this is what has allowed you to pay attention for the last 30 minutes without interrupting. That requires patience and perseverance. These are not things you did well when you were 4 years old. These are things that we have to learn, that we have to practice. And I should say, by the way, that no one's trying to suggest that there's virtue ethics or deontology or utilitarianism, that we use all of these all the time. Within the social sciences, the relational conception of selfhood has also become much more prominent, especially since the advent of Web 2.0 in the early 2000s. So if you read in social science literature on media, social media, and or the internet, you will inevitably run into Irving Goffman, as well as Georg Simmel, perhaps Herbert Mead, all of whom focus on the sociable self, the self as relational. And this gives us then a different notion of privacy that already was emerging or identified in the early 2000s to a notion of shared or group privacy. This is from Patricia Lang, who was observing how young people used YouTube and sort of coded YouTube to shade the audience either to the publicly private, the close friends and relatives who would know what tags to look for in order to find these videos versus the privately public, those videos that you would be willing to share with a larger group of friends, okay? It would still contain highly private and personal information, but not necessarily the most private and personal information you had to share. So if this is happening, if it's true, it raises the rather bothersome question, is there a connection between this Western shift between the relational self and the rise of far-right authoritarian politics in the West? This has been suggested, it is hypothesized, it is explored. I don't know of any knockdown, drag out arguments or evidence that shows that it is so, but there are clearly correlations given what has happened in traditional democratic societies over the last 6 to 8 years. Whether that's the case or not, I think these differences point to the necessity for middle grounds. And so this is what I have referred to as relational autonomy. Relational autonomy comes out of feminist philosophy. It is a loosely related collection of views that share an emphasis on the social embeddedness of the self and on the social structures and relationships that make autonomy possible. This is again reflexive and dialogical, inextricably interwoven with our relationships with others. Unlike that atomistic conception of the self that understands freedom primarily as negative freedom. If I'm an atomistic self and I take up a relationship with an other, whether it's a personal relationship, community state, whatever, that relationship is almost inevitably a threat to my freedom, as a negative freedom. This notion of relationality says, no, we are more free through our relationships. It is our relationships that give us a wider capacity, a wider audience, a wider community within which to engage and learn from and to express ourselves and so on. And so what you find here is an emphasis that some social influences will not compromise, but instead enhance and improve the capacities we need for autonomous agency. That's Andrea Vestlund. Nicely enough, in my view, and perhaps not accidentally, again, this relational autonomy conjoins virtue ethics. We want to have a good life. We want to flourish. We want to have the capacity to practice this phronesis, this distinctive form of reflective judgment and embodied wisdom, sometimes translated as practical wisdom. So Andrea Veltman and Mark Piper also conjoin this with Kantian autonomy. So we can sustain that notion of autonomy that is foundational to democratic society, to conscientious objection, to disobedience, and so forth, alongside efforts to pursue a good life and achieve human flourishing on a good day. This is perhaps not the best slide to be showing you, but it does show, and we can come back to it if you like. So you can now see that we are shifting more perhaps towards somewhere in here, away from a more autonomous individual, which tends to be affiliated with more traditional notion or more modern notions of deontology and utilitarianism. We use our networks, certainly for close tie relationships. What we'll talk about is the intime sphere, but also the other 1,000 friends or so you have on Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, whatever, are your weak tie relationships, all of which are further made possible precisely by the larger communities and networks of automated agents, multi-agent systems, and so forth. And again, as we have shifted towards the upper part of this slide, then virtue ethics has become more prominent, like it or not, along with feminist and care ethics. So this is not just philosophers talking to themselves. This is a reality in the world, in the country that I have the privilege of living in, namely Norway. In the early 2000s, there was work on revising Article 100, which is the article for freedom of expression. And some of the background philosophy for that revision spoke or defined the mature person as this interesting conjunction of the relational and the autonomous, that it assumes a certain competence, socialization, or education required in order to function as an autonomous individual in the open society. But where do we get this? It is attained by the individuals through encounters with other people, listening to their arguments. What a concept, listening to their arguments and trying out their alternative perspectives, perspective taking in good Habermasian terms. The upshot is a reflexive identity that is then capable of functioning in a democratic society, in a robust democratic society. Again, this is not just in law, this is in another form of law and practice, something called the Allemansretten, everyone's right. Everyone who comes to Norway and Sweden is surprised to discover that if you go trekking through, especially North Norway, there is a right of public access to the countryside and nature more broadly conceived of as a common good. This goes back to pre-modern times, if you know something about the commons in the medieval era. But this was codified in 1957. And so otherwise private property, you are allowed to go trekking, collect blueberries, camp, and so forth. Hunting is a different category. It requires other kinds of permissions. But this understands the world that we live in as an inclusive one, not an exclusive property. So if you also know something about Creative Commons licensing, you would recognize this notion. It works there as well. And again, there are post-colonial, decolonial, and post-human middle grounds that resonate with this. And I have references for those if you are interested. This also has to do with perhaps the way we talk about autonomy and thereby privacy. Privacy in the US, again, is grounded in the presumption of spaces and individual spaces. And privacy then ends up being a kind of protection of something substantive or maybe bits of information. So if you do research ethics, we talk about sensitive and personal information that has to be protected. It was one of those wonderful culture shocks coming to Denmark and then Norway to discover that people tended to talk about privacy instead in terms of privatlivet, the private life, and the intime sphere, the intimate sphere of close personal relationships. That it's those information within those relationships that is what needs to be protected. Helen Nissenbaum has developed actually a now prominent theory of privacy for this that talks about privacy in terms of contextual integrity. This is deeply relational. Historically, Nissenbaum has built her theory on James Rachel's earlier work, which also identifies the self in terms of social roles, as you might see there. But what this means then is privacy rights are defined in terms of flows of information. The information you tell within the context of your doctor-patient relationship is a bit of information that doctor should not be sharing as a bit of information in a different context, doctor talking to the pharmaceutical companies. And the same is true of information shared within specific webs of relationships. It's okay shared within a group of close friends, close girlfriends, close boyfriends, whatever, but this is not something that would be shared in a different set of relationships and so on. Again, this is not just philosophical theory, as much as I like theory. This was already encoded in the Norwegian guidelines for internet research ethics as early as 2006, meaning researchers are obliged to protect both individual privacy and the privacy of those in the close relationships. This is made explicit in those guidelines. We also endorse this in the third version or addition to the Internet Research Ethics Guidelines from the AIR project. So if this is the case, then what can we do with it? And what we can do with it is maybe think about some kind of pluralism that would somehow get us across these differences. And so I will speak a little bit about ethical pluralism as a philosophical concept, and then try to give some examples, and then move on to a final sort of characterization of a pluralistic intercultural privacy. So to talk about ethical pluralism requires a little bit more care. And I will go through this a little bit quickly, but I'm hoping that the diagrams will be helpful. When we started with this in the 1990s, we were faced with a number of prevailing dualisms. Some of you may recognize jihad versus McWorld, the fear that the world would either break down into some kind of fragmentary, tribalistic, violent world, very unfairly affiliated with the notion of jihad. And my apologies to anyone with Islamic background or Islamic sensibilities or sympathies. It's a term we don't like to use at all in this context. Or McWorld. So McDonald's takes over the world. It's one homogenous culture yet again, driven by primarily US-centric corporations and so forth. But we also had those dualisms in our conceptions of cyberspace. So if you read one of the early novels, Neuromancer, it discusses the bodiless exaltation of cyberspace. So there's this mind-body dualism. The problem with this, both politically and personally, comes up especially if we try to understand cultural identities as separated by such irreducible differences. So think of differences such as language, politeness practices, gender roles, conceptions of the self, more hierarchical, more egalitarian, and so on. So we see that there are these differences. What do we do with them? Well, we can start with dualism. And if we want to preserve that irreducible difference, then nothing can connect these two, or any kind of connection threatens to obliterate the one in favor of the other. As a first step, we then try to think of common grounds. Are there some kinds of things that we can share alongside these differences, holding the two together? Perhaps, and this is both inevitable but also problematic. On the one hand, it is inevitable and perhaps helpful, despite all of the criticisms that can be raised about efforts to have notions that are universal or quasi-universal. There are arguably common grounds that exist cross-culturally. So Clifford Christians has identified what he calls proto-norms, such as the sanctity of human life, truth-telling, and nonviolence, that he and his team have, over the past 20 years, found to be in all of the cultures they have been able to pay attention to. If you're familiar with political philosophy, you will know of Rawls' notion of an overlapping consensus, or modus vivendi, live and let live pluralism. This is better than nothing by any means. But at the same time, if what we emphasize are common grounds, that these are things everybody should share, then what happens when we run into those people and cultures that don't share them? The problem was pointed out by Tracy Madsen and Strong in 2003. If we assume that all reasonable people ought to share such common understandings, then we easily dehumanize those who in fact do not share them. And you can figure out where these phrases come from. Can you believe how they treat women? They are animals. They think abortion is all right, and so on. So both I and many others, taking a cue importantly from Charles Taylor, wanted to move beyond common grounds to notions of complementarity. And this is importantly different. He describes it as something that would not merely tolerate ethical difference, but would engage it as a path towards deeper forms of human community. The crucial idea is that people can bond not in spite of, but because of difference, not because of common grounds, or not just because of common grounds, but because we embrace our differences. They can sense that their lives are narrower and less full alone than in association with one another. And again, I like to think that this is not just theory. This is a shot of a neighborhood close to where I live in Oslo. It's called Tøyen. It is one of the more densely populated areas. It is also one of the most multicultural, people from Asia, Africa, the Americas, East Europe, you name it. There's a long history here of immigrant communities being gradually complemented by younger people moving in, some of whom, of course, will have lesbian, etc. So 10 years ago or 8 years ago, when we moved in there, we would hear of gay or lesbian couples walking hand in hand and being yelled at, perhaps physically threatened on the streets. Last spring, a group of young men were observed by one of their elders as setting fire to an LGBTQT plus flag, and they were stopped by him. And his comment was, they're different from us, but they're our neighbors. And I like to hear in that a notion of something that is more than modus vivendi pluralism. Namely, I put up with you because I have to, and I will only accept our common grounds, towards something that's more positive and recognizes that differences enhance and are valuable to both of us. There are these notions of complementarity. They are very ancient. For the musicians in there, or particularly choir singers, you know this from your musical experience. We can have two notes of a chord, an A and a C, for example. And when we hear those two notes together, we hear them as different and yet as a unity. So there is connection, we could say, in the face of irreducible difference. These notions of harmony and resonance are ancient. They're in the Pythagoreans, Plato, East Asian philosophy, you name it, including contemporary Japanese philosophy. And so a particular version of this is what I've called interpretative pros hen pluralism. This is starting in Aristotle, and now I'm hoping that the philosophers of language will not find too many errors here. But if you say in English that she has a healthy appetite, or if you say an apple is healthy to eat, the term healthy has slightly different, but importantly different meanings in those two phrases. They're not reducible to one thing, but they nonetheless cohere in their meaning as they point towards one thing, in this case, health. So pros hen is Greek for towards one, and we're often running, I hope. We have applied this in terms of privacy, for example, in several places. One of my first experiences was in Norway, but this one is a more recent one. Would you in Italy publish individual income and tax payment information on a publicly accessible website? I suspect not. Nobody I have discovered outside of Norway would do this, because it is understood to be, or interpreted to be, too great a violation of individual privacy. We do this in Norway 2 weeks in a year. There are a lot of reasons for doing it. And part of it is we are much more relational. We are much more egalitarian than almost any other Western society I know of. But certainly we don't do it in the United States, which is more individual and hierarchical. So what I'm trying to suggest is we all agree that there is something called privacy that is important to protect, but we interpret or apply what privacy might mean in our different societies in different ways. And so we sustain those differences. Another example is in terms of informed consent. This is from my colleague, Chulalongkorn University, Sarat Hongdarum, who has argued that informed consent as practiced in Thailand is more collective, and it's different from, say, US as more individual, very different in terms of instantiation and praxis, but that we thereby agree, or we focus towards, we point towards this shared notion of informed consent. So again, we have to be careful about too easy cultural generalizations. And at the same time, I want to underline that all of this is still connected with this notion of phronesis, a reflective form of judgment. But there are also other forms that can be found that are similar to this in Confucian thought, especially, but also relational virtue ethics more broadly. including relational ethics in the work of Mark Kokelberg as applied to AI. So this is still another example. Again, Norway and Denmark are highly relational societies, so much so that I have heard people say, I am responsible for the social conditions that allowed this to happen. This being a murder in a different part of a city than you lived in, or perhaps even a different city than you lived in. I am somehow responsible for the social conditions that allow this to happen. So when I was in Denmark, my office key would open the offices of all of my colleagues. This was thought of as a kind of shared or collective inclusive property. And again, in Norway, we don't do that. My office key would only work for my office, but we do this interesting income and income tax information. Nor is this restricted to the Norwegians. This is in the IEEE's project. IEEE is the International Electrical and Electronics Engineers Organization. It's responsible for a lot of the standards in electronic devices, probably everything that you and I touch or own. And they have been engaged in a 3-year project for something called ethically aligned design for artificial intelligence and machine learning systems. This has been most impressive. And if you read into the document, because it's not just philosophers trying to tell engineers what they should be doing, it is engineers speaking with themselves, what should we be doing, with advice and counsel from philosophers. They ended up endorsing an ethical pluralism, deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and acknowledging the importance of relational approaches as well. If you read into the document, I'm going to speed up just a little bit for the sake of ensuring that we quit on time. The executive summary is quoting from Aristotle, that our goal should be eudaimonia, human well-being, flourishing. How do we live good lives, not just lives defined by this one-dimensional emphasis on increased productivity or gross domestic product? So they can join again this kind of deontological emphasis on inalienable fundamental rights, including rights to privacy, as well as notions of human flourishing and environmental sustainability. This is also at work in the EU over the last 3 years. In trying to apply the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR from 2018, which is stronger in important ways. If individuals or groups find that platform companies such as Google or Facebook are violating privacy as defined within the GDPR, they can try to initiate fines and/or class action suits. But at the same time, the GDPR, because this is Europe, and as we said in Switzerland, each canton is different from one another. In Europe, we have a union, but we're all different. The GDPR must allow for pluralistic interpretation. And so there is an overarching single regulatory framework, but at the same time, individual member states can introduce their own legislation as they see fit. This becomes a little bit more explicit in some of the philosophical work behind this, this policy development. So there is something called the Ethics Advisory Group of the European Data Protection Supervisor. They issued a report in 2018. Again, they appealed to Kant, Kant's notion of rational autonomy as grounding what they see centrally European values: dignity, autonomy, freedom, solidarity, equality, and trust. So that's very nice from a Kantian perspective. They see it as both an individual and a collective, so they see it in a somewhat relational term. At the same time, in doing so, they thereby echo what we saw before. In Veltman and Piper, and then the IEEE, this conjunction of Kantian deontology with a virtue ethics or capability ethics. If we had longer time, we could go into the sort of history and development of information and computing ethics, which begins with Norbert Wiener as the father of cybernetics. Cybernetics actually comes from a Greek example of the Kubernetes, or the steersman, who exemplifies ethical reflective judgment, Phronesis, self-corrective judgment. Wiener's book, The Human Use of Human The Human Use of Human Beings is considered the first sort of ethics book in these domains. And so there is this strong thread from Wiener through IEEE through the EU, for which I think is a good thing. Last but not least, this is also in EU law as well with regard to AI. And so Floridi et al. Appeal to human dignity, Kant, and flourishing for a good AI society, including then the virtue ethics notions of self-realization and flourishing. What we want to protect with the development of AI is the ability of people to flourish in terms of their own characteristics. You might hear in there an echo of that old German Persönlichkeitsrecht. What we wanted to develop is the free unfolding of the personality. Burgess does take a common grounds approach at first, focusing on commonalities in how human beings experience the digital world and how they may become vulnerable in light of their new technological condition. But at the same time, this is at least recognizably pluralistic. So these values must be understood and implemented in the cultural, social, political, economic, and not least technological contexts in which the crucial link between personal data and personal experience is made. So I like to think that there's a pluralism in there. Can this get us to a pluralistic intercultural privacy? As a philosopher, my stock answer is yes, no, and maybe. Let us see. On the one hand, ethical pluralism, including pro-sen ethical pluralism, continues to flourish. There was a special issue of the Journal of Contemporary Eastern Asia this past summer that focused on ethical pluralism. Surat Honglodarum used my pro-sen ethical pluralism as a way of understanding and avoiding imperialistic or colonizing agreement across cultures, but he modified the Aristotelian version of it in an interesting way. Both Aristotle and Kant tended to assume a notion of human nature that was somehow fixed or given a priori. We know better than that these days. And so Surat argued that we can have a one towards which we want to aim, but that would be an empirically grounded one, something that pops up through praxis in our everyday experience, not to be pre-given. Kinsu, Tom Williams, and Rushen Wen did an article on role-based morality from Confucian tradition, using a pluralistic approach to designing robots in both East and Western contexts. So this seems kind of practical and useful. At the same time, while every effort has been made to avoid a sort of Western-centric imperialistic dimension to all of this, it is clear that there are risks that, especially if we invoke Western philosophers from Aristotle through Carol Gilligan, through Shannon Bauer, through Mark Kokelberg, that we risk remaining Western-centric. And so Ayesha Gautam and Deepa Singh have produced an article, a very nice article, called Building Bridges, Eurocentric to Intercultural Information Ethics. And they unpack an Indian notion of samvad as a carefully structured praxis of dialogue that does the same thing as pro-sen pluralism, but within a squarely Indian context and history. And so this might be a kind of meta-ethical or meta-ethical pluralism. Two different kinds of pluralism, but they agree on this structure of shared norms that we get to through diverse interpretations, applications, and so forth. Last but not least, and this gets us to the social credit rating system again. Rocky Clancy has argued that we in the weird societies, I just love this acronym, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures have solved the problem of large social cooperation over the past 3 millennia because we have big gods, so the gods of the Abrahamic traditions. And this has allowed us to do large social cooperation. This was never the case in China. And so what he argues, just as we had Antigone, they did not. We had Abrahamic gods, they did not. He argues that large scale cooperation emerges as the one in China achieved by the social credit rating system in China. And so this is a good thing. We both aim towards large-scale cooperation, and we get to it through very, very different ways. Yes, but is this a pluralism of privacy? Not quite. And so what I want to suggest is that, in a kind of final way, privacy, like Aristotle's being, ta'on, is said in many ways. I'm not a huge fan of the United States approach, as you have probably seen in several ways. It tends to emphasize individual privacy. It has nominal privacy regulations. How well it will protect its citizens from what Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism, state interests since 9/11, the National Security Agency, and so forth, I think is questionable, not certain. I have much greater optimism, or I at least have more optimism with regard to both the EU and Scandinavia. The EU still, to my knowledge, focuses primarily on individual privacy, but we do have strong privacy regulations, and even stronger since 2018. Scandinavia, as we've seen, has a more relational and individual understanding of privacy, which I think is better. I think it's closer to what human beings actually do. So I'm hopeful that it will also serve as a good defense against surveillance capitalism and so forth. The Chinese social credit system may protect some form of collective privacy. But again, even though individual privacy rights are written into the Chinese constitution, I don't think there's much reason to be optimistic that with the Chinese social credit system, individual privacy rights will be very closely protected. And so I see in the EU and Scandinavia, especially in the discussion we have seen, an emerging AI ethics for good as hopeful as it works against familiar problems of bias, problematic efforts at preemptive policing. Compass is a system that was developed in the United States to use AI to try to determine which prisoners would be most likely to stay out of prison if they were paroled and so forth. Again, guess what? It was biased against African-American prisoners and so forth. But at the same time, I also hope that these approaches, especially within the EU and Scandinavia, will sustain these central democratic rights to resist, disobey, and contest, which again, I hold to be perhaps the most central forms of expression of a robust democracy. More work is to be done. There's an upcoming conference on intercultural ethics and technology at Twente in January. Surat and others whom I've mentioned will be there. But I thought I would close with some Scandinavian inspiration. I don't know if Pippi Longstocking has made it to Italy. Pippi Longstrump, as she is known in my part of the world. I've never tried that before, so I'm sure I can do it. And on that happy thought, if you have no other questions whatsoever, I would be very, very curious, now that you have this sort of background in all of these cultural notions, to see what you make of where it is you live and what will happen in your futures. Thank you for your perseverance, patience, and perhaps a little bit of empathy. And should I leave the slide up or move it away?
Sorry?
Should I leave this slide up or move it away for the time being?
Oh, sorry. We had some problems with the microphone. No, it's okay if you want to leave the slide there.
Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I don't know whether there are questions either here in the conference room or in the Zoom room. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure where I would put Italy in this graph.
Okay.
But probably this this position in the middle is quite right. I don't know.
Okay.
If there are other opinions. Otherwise, I can try to break the ice with a question, if
Sure.
it's okay.
Yeah, well, I see that this version of Zoom will let me pause the share. So should we just pause it and put it aside for the time being? I think I just paused it.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. We still have some problems with our speakers in the room.
Okay.
But I mean, during the conference, it was kind of okay. I don't know why now it's more difficult to hear, but okay, we will try. I was interested in the concept of the relational self, and while hearing at your presentation, I recalled your chapter in the On Life Manifesto, especially the part where you mentioned a so-called third space, so the one that is neither exclusively private nor completely public, if I got it right, and which is, or at least for what I understood, is kind of an habitat for the development of such a relational self. And I don't know, while reading your chapter and while listening to your conference now, I linked kind of intuitively this concept to the one of epistemic bubbles that I'm concerned with for my studies. And so because I was wondering whether these third spaces that happens to be in new media, in social media or so on, can be whether we can draw a parallel between these two concepts, or I don't know whether epistemic bubbles can be considered an example of such third spaces, because I don't know, I have the idea of this individual, which, however, is shaped, or whose opinion is shaped thanks to the relations that he or she develops in such a bubble. And I don't know, for example, in Facebook groups or chats or so on. And then those two concepts seem to me quite near. But I don't know if it is just my impression, or if it is a parallel that can rightly exist.
No, I think that's really brilliant, actually. I'm not sure I would have come up with it, so thank you. I think there are very strong overlaps. And to emphasize the positive, first of all, yeah. Again, to use, I used to sing in a choir before COVID came. Especially if you perform with a group or whatever, then you need a safe space in which to practice. And in that safe space, you get better. You get criticized, but you get better. And so I think with that as a sort of simple analogy, yes, both online and offline, there are these sort of third spaces, which are not perfectly public and not perfectly individually private. And in a virtue ethics term, this could be very useful. I mean, I think we do a lot of practice privately, individually, but we certainly need to practice collectively or relationally. So I think that can be very positive. And it certainly fits with this sort of Goffmanian notion of the relational self as a performance, that a lot of people in the social sciences like to use when they, and I think rightly so, when they try to analyze what happens in social media. I would turn back the question in a certain way, maybe, and that it's just a matter of how far will the analogy go. Because I think what we, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I hear you say epistemic bubbles, I hear filter bubbles as well. And so spaces that in some ways are closed. I'm not going to get out of my filter bubble. I'm not going to get out of my epistemic bubble. And if you are of a political ideology or religious ideology or whatever that I don't like or don't care for, I'm not letting you in either. Okay, with all the negatives that entails. What I like to think is that in a real world or an embodied space, so when we do our little choir performances in a church or whatever, we don't control who comes in the door. And so it's perfectly possible that there will be people, not necessarily, aggressive political persuasion, but people with different musical tastes. And they might say, yeah, that's okay, but you might think about this. And so what I'm after is that the risk of the epistemic bubble, its affordance, if you will, because it's online, is it can remain closed and thereby more self-reinforcing than it really should be. Whereas in the offline world, perhaps we are almost inevitably more likely to be exposed. It's a more porous bubble. It will let others in. And that can be painful or unpleasant at points, but it's probably also really useful for further growth and development, if that distinction makes sense. Is that reasonably clear as a start?
Yeah, totally. It's and the parallel came to my mind also because of the suggestion, always if I got it right, that that there could be a problem with our democratic processes and and equality norms if we extend such a relational self without promoting literacy print. And so and at the same time, epistemic bubbles are studied mostly because of the threat that they represent for our epistemic processes. And so this was another point of the, possible analogy that came to my mind, but it was only I don't know, a suggestion. I don't know if it's right, but thank you for your answer because it was very interesting, and I will try to maybe go a bit in depth with some ratings.
We can discuss it. I think it's a very insightful analogy, and one that it would be interesting for me to explore it, because at the risk of sounding like some kind of Norwegian patriot, there is very high literacy rates in Norway, very robust democracy. People get out, but they're also extremely good at using social media. So there's a very lively debate about how filter bubbles in social media can both promote and threaten democracy. So it might be interesting from a cross-cultural perspective as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't want to steal the floor. I don't know whether there are other questions.
I do have one. First of all, thank you for your talk, and I think I got the concept of relation quite wrong, because when in a slide, for example, when we were talking about a relational self, there were examples like being a parent, being a professional, being a spouse, and so on. And so I see these examples more like examples of and so examples of constraints more than instead of relations. And so my question is, how does a relational self flourish through this kind of relationships? And maybe I got it wrong because I'm too Western individualistic centered, but yes, my question is this one.
Okay, no, I think that's a great question, and I don't mean to sound like the old man that I am, but this also depends to some degree on where you are in your life stages. So I would start out by saying, I'm with you, particularly when I was 18, 20, whatever, and my country wanted to send me to a dangerous country called Vietnam. I didn't see how relationship was helping me in that instance. On the other hand, there were people in my community who supported me in my decisions. And so those relations were fostering or supporting my choices and thereby my capacities. So part of what it is the case is that, and part of what I'm after is that as you go through different life stages and get and have different kinds of relationships, you will likely discover ways in which those relationships are not necessarily constraints. They perhaps always contain some element of constraint, but they also open and flourish, help you open and flourish. So I don't think you're mistaken by any means. I think it's a both and, that relationships can be constraining, especially at the very beginning when we're young and we seem to be under the thumb of everybody. But at the same time, even in those relationships, listening to the master is not always a bad idea. It is the society that has given us a language that allows us to articulate and think about what it is we are. And it is these societies that have given us also this notion of disobedience as a positive good that encourages the kinds of self-development and so forth that I've tried to talk about. And in particular, the kind of critical thinking that you're exemplifying. You're raising questions vis-a-vis the alleged authority, in this case, me, the professor. Good on you. That's what you're supposed to do in these cultural traditions. So I think if we worked at it, we'd find very quickly that there's a very long list of relationships that as were described in the slides, don't simply constrain us, but also give us capabilities, places to practice, places to try things out that give us greater freedom in the long run than we would ever have if we were sort of isolated individuals off on an island somewhere. But there is that, and again, to invoke Antigone, sometimes those choices are not clean and they're not pure and they're not satisfying. They can be lose-lose choices as well. Does that make some sense?
Thank you. I will think about this.
Good. Let me know what you think. I would be interested in pursuing that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know, maybe if for Professor S is okay, we can have time for one last question, if obviously there is one. Okay, we have a question here in the room. So.
Good evening, and thank you for your debate.
The
information and communication technologies arise the biggest concern about the age-old debate between ethical relativism and ethical monism. In a global and intimately interconnected world, we need to provide a universal and objective answer to ethical dilemmas. Is it possible? How can your ethical pluralism help us to do so?
Again, that's a great question, and there might be some need to do some terminological unpacking. To begin with, there might be, when you say ethical monism, so I'm assuming that you mean, for example, we have one copyright law, either the US or the EU, but that's it for the whole world. And there might be arguments that that's a good idea. There might be arguments that, by the same token, EU-style privacy regulations are a good idea. And wouldn't it be nice if everybody did it that way? So I'm not opposed to ethical monism per se, but I worry about it for reasons that I hope are clear, namely that particularly when it is driven by US-centric economic and political interests, it tends to have a strongly imperialistic colonizing dimension to it that I find ethically objectionable. And so I'm not opposed to monism if we can do it, where we can do it, if it's clear that that's the best thing. But I think that having pluralism in our pocket as a possibility, as an additional sort of way of thinking about ethics in our toolkit, this will be much better for avoiding the problems of imperialism, colonization, and so forth. I'm also, and you might, and if you want to say then, well, that's not objective because it's pluralistic, I'm not sure, we'd have to spend some time unpacking what do you mean by objective. It's objective that there is this one that we agree upon, but you may be worried, and for good reasons, that when I interpret this one, privacy, whatever, in Italy using my judgment, which is reflective, vis-a-vis how I do it in Norway, that reflective judgment introduces a notion of subjectivity that you would want to worry about. I don't think you would be wrong to worry about it, but I resist the idea that there's an either or between a purely objective ethics that is always correct and a purely subjective ethics that is always wrong. Again, what I think happens in this middle ground is we get a range of judgments that allow for a certain continuum of possibilities, but not all possibilities. It doesn't devolve into ethical relativism. And so the example I gave you of China, can we see China's social credit system as an example of a pluralistic approach to large-scale social cooperation? Yeah. Can we see it as an acceptable form of a pluralistic solution to protecting individual privacy rights? I don't think so. They fall out of the spectrum at that point. And I don't think that saying that's my judgment. It's open to revision. Other people may judge differently, but I don't think that makes my judgment merely an individual or arbitrary expression of taste, like what kind of pizza do you like? So we need another hour or two seminar to sort out these positions, but I hope at least some of that is clear as at least a sort of springboard for further discussion and reflection. Thank you for the question. It's brilliant.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have come to an end. At least we in the conference room of the college are out of time because we have plenty of events and the conference is needed for another. The conference room is needed for another seminar.
Yeah.
So, well, I want to thank you once more, Professor S, for your time and for your very interesting conference. It was an honor and a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, and likewise. And I'm retired, so I'm happy to get email from inquiring minds about hard and difficult questions, and we'll try to respond to them as quickly as possible. Which may be difficult these days. But also, if people want to see the slides, we should figure out a way of doing that.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank you also who attended the conference, and to recall that on the 18th of January, we will have the last conference of the series, the conference of Professor Carlo Vercellone, who will give us a more economic perspective on the dam of ICTs and society. So see you on the 18th. And again, thank you to Professor S for being with us.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Same to you. Bye.
Bye-bye.